Good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock. It is pouring down rain, and it's time for 10 with Tim. Listen, just a little thing. I don't know how fast your internet is or what it's like when you watch this on your Facebook, but I'm noticing when I go back and watch, there's just a moment before I talk when I'm just sitting here staring, and it must look really weird to some of you if you notice that or see that. I'm telling you, I'm talking to my phone, and this whole thing is just, it is what it is. But I start talking when the red light comes on, and apparently the camera comes on my phone before the red light comes on. And so I am aware of the fact that I'm sitting here like an idiot looking at my phone but before I start talking. But if that camera's going to come on before that red light, I have no idea. So y'all just, laugh at that, whatever. I can't help that. I hate that. But anyway, good morning and welcome. I'm so glad you're with me. We do this not because I'm good at camera work, but because we're in the Word of God together. We go verse by verse, and we're in Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 to 34 today. So jump in with me. This is, I don't know, it's probably not your favorite, passage in the book of Genesis that we're reading today. It seems kind of, some people would say just dry. There's not a sermon to preach out of this, although I could, but you know what I mean? This isn't something preachers are drawn to, in order to preach. It's just really simple. Abimelech comes back to Abraham and they form a treaty. A peace treaty between the two men, the two groups, the two chieftains. But let me just point out a couple of things. First off, remember that Abraham is 105 years old at this point, something like that. I don't know, about 105. And we think of him as a Bible character, who lives this amazing life because we've read, a handful of episodes in the book of Genesis about how God works. But do you understand how much of his life was not exciting? How much of his life was not a story, that preachers want to come back and preach, in thousands of years? Most of his life was really ordinary, like most of your life. He got up every morning. In this case, he would look for water. And he would deal with sick animals and manage a household that actually was pretty difficult. Remember that he's at this point still more or less an alien. He's an immigrant. He's wandering. God called him to come and follow him and trust him, and he would make of him a great nation. But he had to leave his home and go to a place that God would show him. And so, for a lot of Abraham's story that we've been reading, his concern is safety and security. He has no claim to any place he goes. Again, he's an immigrant. He's an alien. You notice, he and Sarah have, resorted to, questionable tactics because they're just afraid, people will kill them. They've been saying I'm brother and sister. We've talked about that. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you can see how strangers can be treated. Now we know they were angels, but the men of Sodom just saw them as outsiders, and they were there to humiliate and otherwise mistreat them. So when you are a stranger and an alien in a strange land, you have no security. And so Abraham and Sarah, as I said, they had sort of taken in their own hands, trying to find ways of making themselves secure. None of that works out well, but it brings me to our passage today. This is the second episode with Abimelech. And I want you to notice how the stories of Abimelech, that they're like bookends around the birth of Isaac. Right before Isaac is born, we have the first episode with Abimelech, where Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem, as his wife, because he thinks, that she's Abraham's sister, that whole deal. It's that same Abimelech, right? So he comes back now after Isaac is born and after the primary rival to Isaac's inheritance, who is Ishmael, has been expelled. So in many ways, we've seen God fulfill his promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. But now God needs to make good on his promise to make him secure in the land. And this is where Abimelech comes in. And I know it seems really ordinary, but God often works in ways that are just sort of ordinary. So Abimelech approaches Abraham. which is in some ways a testimony to Abraham's, power and prominence. Remember, he left everything just to follow God, but God has been adding to his wealth. God's just been blessing him in all the ways a man can be blessed, and then blessing everybody, out of, blessing Abraham, making Abraham himself a blessing to others. And Abimelech sees that. So Abimelech comes in first off and says, God is obviously with you. Now, I said I could stop and preach a sermon. I could stop and preach that sermon right here, because I just wonder if when people look at your life, would they say, oh my goodness, God's hand is certainly upon her. I can see God at work in his life. Would people say that? Because like I say, Abimelech is just like a neighboring, king, but he can just observe from what he knows of Abraham. And again, he's had some run-ins, but his primary assessment is, man, this dude, I don't know if I can trust him, but I know that God, somehow is always presiding over him, I want that for my life. People are going to look at me and go, man, that dude is not perfect. That dude's got, that dude kind of messed up, but man, there's something of God. I can see God at work in him, because this is Abraham, as we've said. Abimelech's primary, encounter was, the whole lie of, she my sister, actually she's my half sister, actually kind of my wife, all of that, was terrifying to Abimelech. But the bottom line is, he comes to this awareness, this strong conviction about, something about Abraham's God. And man, I want God's hand on my life like that. And I hope you do too. So Abimelech approaches Abraham and says, listen, let's make a treaty. Now, notice he says, I want to make a treaty where you don't lie to us. You can't be deceiving us. Notice it's kind of a treaty because Abimelech's not sure. I mean, Abraham's lied to him once, and Abraham's already said, everywhere I go, we tell the same lie. Remember? And so now Abimelech's like, no, I want us to make a formal agreement that you won't deceive me or any of my descendants. Notice, interesting here, there's no mention of Abraham's descendants, no mention of an heir, because this is setting up the next story, which we'll do tomorrow. But for now, it's just this. I just need to know that we're going to live together in peace. It is a military treaty. Notice that Phicol, who is Abimelech's general, his army commander, is there, which is to say this is a military agreement. This is a way of saying this is going to be a pact of non-aggression. We're going to be forthright and honest. There's going to be no deceit and no aggression between us. This is like a formal treaty. And again, I just remind you, the only reason Abraham is here is because, Abimelech invited him to, hey, stay as long as you want, live wherever you want. I mean, that's how that last episode ended. And so now Abimelech just recognizes Abraham's power and prominence, and perhaps the possibility that Abraham could be a threat to Abimelech's own future dynasty. And so he just says, hey, let's cut a covenant. And that's the language. Your translation probably doesn't say that, but it's what they do. Same thing that God and Abraham did a few chapters ago. They cut a covenant. So notice before they do, Abraham says, well, about that well, because Abimelech said, I'm not sure I can trust you. And Abraham says, I'm not sure I can trust you. Water is a valuable resource. And so one of the first tests of this kind of treaty relationship would be, can they negotiate a valuable resource like water? Remember in the previous story, Hagar and Ishmael are about to die of thirst. I mean, water is a rare and valuable commodity. And so the first thing they have to do is negotiate this issue of the well. Abraham says, your boys have taken over this well and won't let my boys get to it. And Abimelech says, well, I don't know what boys you're talking about, but this is the first I'm hearing of it. But at any rate, notice how they negotiate the resources there. And once it's clear that they can do that, then they cut the covenant. Notice that Abraham himself provides all the animals to cut the covenant. And make no mistake, except for those 7 ewes, those 7 sheep, these animals are slaughtered. They cut a covenant. Remember how I said they would slaughter the animals, divide them in 2, and then walk between it. That they have cut a covenant. That's what they just did. But then there are these 7 lambs that are given as a witness. Notice that this is sort of an obligation. When Abimelech accepts this gift of the lambs, it is a testimony that he's also accepting Abraham's version of the well. It's Abraham's well. He dug the well, and these lambs are a witness to that. I know it sounds weird. It sounds kind of complicated. But at the end of this, Abraham plants a tree, which is an interesting kind of expression. He doesn't build an altar. He plants a tree. It's an expression of God being his source, God being the source of his prosperity. And here it's the first place that God has called a particular name, Olam, which is a Hebrew word for everlasting. He's God the everlasting. It's this idea that what God does lasts forever, what God promises, God keeps his word forever. God is the everlasting God. And this is the name upon which Abraham calls at the end of the story when he plants the tree in testimony of God's faithfulness. Now Abraham is secure in the land. He has a treaty with Abimelech. So now he will dwell in safety and prosperity. So God has kept his promise, right? And there are no more threats to the promise, right? Oh, yeah. Tomorrow, chapter 22, verses 1 to 24. The giant test of faith in God's promises. If there's no more threat, if Abraham has his heir and now he has his safety in the land, then what could go wrong? Well, what if Isaac is no more? And tomorrow is the great test of Abraham's faith, the sacrifice of Isaac. It's a great passage. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 24. That's where we'll be tomorrow. Great passage tomorrow. So join me in the morning at 10 o'clock, 10 with Tim. Listen, stay warm, stay dry, stay safe. Whatever happens, I'll do my best to be with you tomorrow. If we're all iced in, whatever. Get your milk and get your bread and get your word and stay in it. And I'll see you in the morning, 10 o'clock, Lord willing. I love you guys so much. Thank you for all your encouragement. Thank you for being in the word. Stay in it. And